I was surprised by the outcome.
It was very unsettling the day after the referendum.
People don't really know in general what's going to happen to the UK. We don't know the details about Brexit.
It took me quite a while to really come to terms with it, to believe it.
Brexit was good in terms of democracy because your vote actually mattered.
I've had huge arguments with lots of colleagues. Something important was happening and people felt there were real stakes in it.
I feel that student voting can be quite idealistic.
Well, to some extent one learns to live with however the world is.
My starting point on all of this is to think about my own journey to Europe. My father actually immigrated to the United States in 1955 from a small town outside of Leiden in the Netherlands. And he set out just after the war to start a new life in the United States. And when I was 27, roughly the same age that he came to the United States, I came to Britain for a year on a research project. And I settled here. So what's interesting then with the outcome of the referendum to leave the European Union is at a very personal level, it felt very unsettling and very strange on the day after the vote. You feel like the tectonic plates had shifted, that there was an unease in the country and a great deal of uncertainty about what happens next. So at a very, very personal level, that was my initial response to what had happened. And then as I've been observing, you know, the high-level negotiations and all of the sorts of evolutions since that date, I can't say that I'm feeling any better about what's happening here. And I also discovered a number of my colleagues voted for leaving the EU, so I've spent some time thinking about and I'm trying to understand that perspective.
I found it really exciting that, you know, politics mattered, that suddenly we were having debates in Britain that we haven't had for sort of 30 years and people felt there were real stakes in it and everybody was wanting to talk. So you would go into Nottingham, you'd go into a charity shop and the charity shop workers would be arguing about Brexit. Or you'd go out to the university and there would be the gardeners and they would be discussing the single market, or you'd hear the cleaners. Similarly, you know, ordinary people were engaged. I've had huge arguments with lots of colleagues. You know, I'm a sort of minority. I think I'm the only person along this corridor that voted leave. I might be the only person in my department. I might be the only person in this building. So I'm quite used to other people's arguments around this.
The referendum was a blow for me personally. It was very close in Nottingham. And it made me wonder why so many people had voted to leave Europe. I don't think their voting choices were necessarily only about leaving Europe.
I was surprised by the outcome. I had seen the effectiveness of the Leave campaign. I thought it would mobilise a lot of support. I didn't think it would mobilise 52% of the British population. Historically speaking, if you look at referenda and how they work, people tend to vote in favour of the status quo, especially when it comes to big political or constitutional changes. People tend to err on the side of caution, no matter what they say beforehand, when it comes to the question of where they actually put that tick when they're inside the ballot box.
I felt really lousy at the morning of the referendum. There were a few interesting encounters. We've got very good close ties to our neighbours and some of them actually came over to apologise in the name of the nation. I found that very sweet. Others were just in tears. I feel quite bad for students who now are at university. Many of them don't have the perspective to realise how much they are losing, how much they would lose by losing their European citizenship, how much they would lose by being kicked out of the Erasmus program that would allow them to study anywhere in Europe. So I think the students now are really, really getting a bad deal by the government, by the society. And of course, that's in addition to all the other troubles that every UK citizen is facing.
So you're involved in party politics?
Yes.
Yeah.
Far too heavily.
All right. mean, I felt very unsettled by the vote. The day after, I remember walking around thinking 1 in every 2 of you voted out. Why? You know, the obverse of that is that you reflect very deeply about what did I miss? How did I not see that coming? And what does it mean now? And I felt really, really unsettled and as if on shifting sand. And I still do in many ways, walking around thinking about society and politics in general. Universities want to stay because universities disproportionately benefit from EU membership. But that redistribution of common money to the research enterprise benefited Britain because Britain has better institutions on balance in terms of high quality research than the rest of Europe. And that's guaranteed for some transition period, but then that will all go away. And we don't know what access will be to European funding after that. But I wondered what your reactions were day after the vote. You know, how did you feel from a personal, almost guttural level?
I don't know, I felt like a bubble had been burst. Like I'd been living in this kind of like socialist, liberal bubble, and it took a lot of like my own like looking into stuff to kind of figure out why people voted the way that they did.
My family are Irish immigrants, so they've come over to this country. Many of whom did vote for Brexit, actually. But a sense of kind of less surprised, I suppose, than many other people. People think that the kind of UKIP movement is a recent thing, but they were first elected into the European Parliament when I was 2 years old. Mm-hmm. So this kind of Euroscepticism has been in the country for the last 40 years.
It's been right down through the Tory party as well. So, yeah.
And
Labour Party.
Labour Party.
Yeah.
And there's never really been a narrative in this country, especially in the media, of saying, actually, you know what, the EU is a really positive thing.
What's the EU ever done for us?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I wasn't shocked when it happened. I mean, I woke up with a sense of dread because I'd lost, basically. That was I'd lost. I was a Remainer. I had a few friends who were Brexiteers, and I knew the arguments, sympathised with the arguments, but I think one of the things that only happened after Brexit happened was I started to understand the sort of populist aspect of it and the legitimate reasons why people wanted a backlash against. You've been told by David Cameron that you should stay in the EU because it's great for the country. But if you're from a town that's been forgotten, I can understand completely why you look at David Cameron and his Etonians and you just go, sorry Dave,
that's not me.
It might be great for you, it might be great for the metropolitan elites, but it's not good for me.
Britain underwent tremendous socioeconomic change in the post-war period, and it became what we call in political science a post-industrial country. And what that means is that over 50% of the workforce is now employed in the service sector, and that manufacturing jobs, extractive jobs, standard what we would call working class jobs where someone could leave school, go up the road to the factory or into the mine or somewhere very, very close to home, and actually maybe even enter an industry that their parents had worked in, and they would be the next generation that would work in that industry. Those jobs were gone. So if we think about the mining that left this country, if we think about some of the manufacturing, car manufacturing, steel manufacturing, really strong industrial-based type jobs started to leave this country because the country transformed itself into a service economy. So there's been a migration southward to find that employment in those service sector jobs. So if one thinks about insurance, financial services, banking, lawyers, etc., a lot of those jobs concentrate in London because there's an economy of scale in London that is very attractive for people to go and work there.
There was a sense of drift, a sense of, sort of coming up for, well, now it's coming up for 10 years since the Great Recession, a sense of an elite that was out of touch. We've been there before, moments historically where you had an elite that was out of touch. I was an undergraduate when there was the miners' strike, and that was probably the last sort of equivalent time when there were really big divisions in British society.
I'm a miner, I dig coal, I work hard down a hole. I get mucky and I get cold, but it's either that or on the dole. They're shooting fate, I've heard it all. Now my back's again the wall. Golden handshake, so they say. What good's that with no more pay? I know what I am, I'm a miner. I need bread and jam to be a miner. What would I be if I gave it up? Out of work and out of luck.
The miners' strike is absolutely of significance for Nottinghamshire, and I think when people come to the history of Nottinghamshire in 100 years' so time, it was almost like civil war at the time, where communities were very split, and it was the Nottinghamshire miners who broke the national strike. They went back to work in the belief that by going back to work they would protect their jobs and their families and their communities' livelihoods. Now that turned out not to be the case. Although they did end up going back to work, the pits then closed in subsequent years. So not only did they break the strike and break the morale of the mining communities across the whole country, they then also lost their jobs as well. So they were kind of felt doubly bad about everything that had happened. And okay, it's a generation ago, but it normally takes 2 or 3 generations for those memories to dissipate and for communities to get over that kind of a shock. So there's a deep suspicion of the ruling classes, there's a deep suspicion of managers, there's a deep distrust of politicians generally. I think it's a very complex issue.
If you think about those communities, sort of, the Single European Act came after, in the wake of the miners' strike, that for many mining communities, many communities in the north, the European project is associated with Margaret Thatcher. You know, the Single European Act came in the wake of the defeat of the miners. So the European Union has been working really well for the metropolitan capitals of Europe, but really badly for those areas outside of the capitals.
The other thing is that as a result of being part of Europe, there has been a lot of inward migration into those communities, which already felt they were struggling for public services, and the extra pressures from European immigration have placed on those communities is possibly one of the things that's exacerbated people's concerns about being part of Europe. I think successive governments in this country have completely neglected the skills basis of large swathes of the community in this country, and that's left to a great level of dissatisfaction and possibly led to a lot of those communities feeling that they have been left behind. And as I say, I don't think everybody who voted Leave was doing it because they wanted to leave Europe. I think it was just an anti-government vote at the time.
It's almost too big to get your arms around. You should come here and spend a day. You see all the sort of contradictions, dualities. So within Nottingham, we get this fantastic microcosm of all of the problems that manifest themselves within the vote for Brexit. Okay, so we're standing in a centre of great historical significance. The castle in Nottingham played a prominent role in the English Civil War. And really, since that time until now, this city has been representative of social conflict. But we're also standing next to a metaphorical character who is not based in history in that sense. This is Robert of Locksley, of course, but also known as Robin Hood, who, you know, was on the side of social justice, stealing from the rich to give to the poor, and the merry men in the woods, etc. But my question, I guess, to start all this is, if we're contemplating Brexit, what side of the Brexit debate do we think Robin Hood would be on? Because it's not obvious what he would be. So I just wonder what your reflections on, if Robin Hood were alive today, how do you think he would have voted in the referendum to leave the European Union?
I think he'd be a Brexiteer, purely for the reality of what the European Union has become. Right. So the unfettered sort of excess that you associate with bureaucrats in Brussels, like Juncker, typified in his champagne excess. I think he would agree with the idea of an economic union if it was for that purpose, to spread wealth to those who really need it. But I think if he saw the reality of it, he would be firmly against it.
So you're for Robin Hood being a Brexiteer. Does anyone want to argue the opposite case? Do you think perhaps Robin Hood would have been a Remainer?
I'd like to think he'd be worried about the effects on the poorest of leaving the European Union. But I think because he was quite anti-establishment, he probably would be a Brexiteer.
Right.
I just want to ask Daisy, because you're a medievalist, you've been studying medieval history, where do you think Robin Hood would have stood on this issue?
I actually agree with you. I think he would have been a Brexiteer, but then we've got to remember, like, he was a noble as well, so I don't know, it's a bit of a...
But he was a rebel noble, right?
He was a rebel noble, but at the end of the day, I don't know, like, I agree, like, he was quite anti-establishment. I could see him being a Brexiteer.
Yeah.
Interesting, thanks. What about you?
I don't think he'd have voted in it. as a pure anarchist figure that he was. But I can really pick up on, like, you know, Nottingham is associated with Robin Hood. I work for a charity that gets its funding from the EU, that supports children and young adults that are at risk of gang violence and getting dragged into criminality, and our funding all comes from the EU. So without that funding, you know, the City Council has already cut youth services and drug and alcohol support services. There's going to be nothing to actually support the people who are going to be the hardest hit by Brexit's, you know, lack of funding.
So you haven't had a promise. You haven't had a promise from central government to replace any of that funding. Because part of the deal, at least during the vote, was that if we don't have to pay in, then there's more money nationally to fund the sorts of things that were funded by the EU. But there's been a big disconnect there.
Well, there is talk now of what's going to be called the Shared Prosperity Fund, which is how the money that's currently sent to Europe will be spent in the UK. But because we're now in whatever happens, there's going to be a 2-year transition period. I think the conversations about how we use that Shared Prosperity Fund have been postponed for 2 years because the money's not going to come back into the UK.
Yeah, I'm from a town near Portsmouth called Gosport, and it's a very deprived area. I think you can feel it when it was a very high leave area, and I think the reason it voted Brexit was a backlash because they wanted a change. I mean, it was the devil they knew against the uncertainty of maybe it could get better. So obviously I'm very worried about EU funding, especially in charitable organisations that help the most disenfranchised, the people who need it the most. But at the same time, maybe Brexit will be they voted for Brexit, so.
I'm concerned that it's going to hit people the hardest who are already accessing food banks, who are already accessing community interest groups for the services that the council has cut. Brexit means that those services are going to be stretched even further. I use Terence Higgins Trust. I'm HIV positive. We get a lot of our funding from national lottery grants, from European funding, you know, and as soon as we're outside of the EU, half of that funding stream is going to be dried up. So, you know, people who are newly diagnosed, there is no services within the NHS now. It's all been sent out to charities or private companies to run those services, and that's just not going to be that.
So the only difference in local government and the funding that's available is basically it will come from a different pot.
Yes. And at the moment it looks like it would still be coming straight from London.
So then London decides who gets what.
Yeah, and interestingly, the power of London is sucking the north-south divide south. Because London is just drawing the resources southward. And the investment across all areas of governance is focused in London and the South East, way out of proportion to what happens in the Midlands and the North.
It's interesting to see that the regions that voted overwhelmingly in favour of leave were often regions that had benefited most economically from membership in the European Union, places like Wales that had received very significant subsidies from the European Union. But I think what the Leave campaign did very effectively is mobilise this idea of freedom, that the EU was portrayed as a kind of bureaucratic superstructure, and that in a sense it was better to be, you know, even if you were economically less well off, that you were in charge of your own fate, the economic destiny of your community, rather than being under the tutelage of some unaccountable monster organisation.
It's a very nuanced, dangerous, complicated set of issues that have been unleashed by this. And in a sense, it makes people feel good that they finally got aired because they've been bubbling along for 30 years. But on the other side of the equation is, do we really know what we're letting ourselves in for? And I think that's the uncertainty and the fear that many people have.
I'm here today outside Hallwood Library to try and find some students to tell us about how they feel about Brexit. It's in the middle of exam season at the moment, so the library's packed, so we're here to try and find someone willing to tell us how they feel. If I can just get you to sum up how you feel about Brexit.
In one word, I would sum up Brexit as just annoyed, really.
In a word, I'd sum up Brexit as problematic. People don't really know in general what's going to happen to the UK. We don't know the details about Brexit. We don't know how it's going to affect not just the economy but like society as a whole, like So I think no one really knows for certain what's going to happen.
We can only sort of presume what sort of Brexit we're going to get, or is it going to be softer or harder, whatever they're trying to make out.
I'm also wondering if it's going to affect the Erasmus grant. That is definitely something that I personally benefited from a lot last year. Like, I would not have been able to do a year abroad without the Erasmus grant. I would feel really, really sad if I thought that language students of the future won't get the same opportunity that we did, because honestly, a year abroad was such an amazing experience in so many ways.
If you could sum up Brexit in a word.
For me, Brexit in one word represents opportunity. I do get people saying, how could you think that? You're stupid. I'm like, well, I mean, I don't think I'm stupid. I think I've made the right decision based upon the evidence that was presented. And I think everyone wants this country to have the NHS. The NHS is an amazing thing. And there's no real models like that anywhere else in the world. But I don't see that you can have free movement of labour for the whole of Europe and the NHS. And I think that's where you get a lot of differences in students who are very idealistic.
I voted to remain.
And is that something you feel quite strongly about?
Well, I felt quite strongly about the low quality of the debate. I felt that the genuine issues about whether or not it was economically good for Britain to stay or to leave were not debated. I felt that there was a hidden agenda behind the leave argument. So I felt that what I tried to do within the circle that I had, social media and the like, is to try to bring people to a genuine type of debate.
Brexit in one word for me.
Complicated. Trying looking for the exact word in my mind. Unknown. Fear of the unknown. Time will tell, I guess. That really depends on what Brexit means, and as we all know, Brexit means Brexit. So.
How do you feel about it?
I'm not angry, exasperated. I feel exasperated. I feel that people didn't approach it the correct way. People should have been a bit more detached and emotional.
Annoyed with the people in power, really, just abusing the trust which people had, and I suppose I don't think it was necessarily wrong. People were ill-informed in the first place.
Something you feel very strongly about?
Relatively speaking, yeah. It does affect our future at the end of the day, and quite a big deal for us.
Quite strongly about it, yes.
I spent the morning then talking to students about their views on Brexit. I guess to chip in my view, I was a Remainer. Things have become a little bit more complicated since then, obviously, as we've seen it so chaotically unravel. The resounding thing we've heard today is that the uncertainty that students have expressed is something I definitely agree with. One thing, though, that's really struck me, actually, speaking to students, was some of the similarities in the way the Leave side and the Remain side spoke about it. Admittedly, we only spoke to one Leave student, but he did frame the Remain ambition as idealistic. And kind of based on some imagined ideals even, about what the nation should look like and what a nation is and how it should, work. But by the same token, people were calling the Leave argument very idealistic and imagined and based on imagined ideas. And I think that shows really that there's been a massive disconnect between the people that want to stay and want to leave, and the quality of the political debate that's happened between those two. I think it's been markedly poor. And I wonder if the internet's got something to do with that. We've put it to a few students, what role did social media have? And I wonder if that's a big part of this, that the Remain and Leave don't talk to each other, that friends have been lost over this. Maybe we've gone about that in the wrong way, and maybe we should be asking some serious questions about what the internet has done to the way we talk to each other about politics, because that may well have had a role.
If you really are the vocal generation, what explains the low turnout among young people in the vote for the European leaving the EU?
Apathy.
Right. So vocal but lazy.
I argue. It was on a Wednesday. It was in the middle of exam season for young people. Like, actually having it on a working day during a busy period, that was never gonna have a high turnout. Like,
wasn't there some issue that you have to sort of get your card in your hometown? If you study, you're not in your
hometown. So you had to go home to vote, right?
So it was a bit of
an extra
faff,
barrier
because you've got to get a postal voting place, change your place of voting. So I had to get a train home to vote.
The amount of times I've had to
and people who
re-register.
Some people can't afford to do that.
People can't afford that. It was, you know, it was done in such a way that it priced people out of voting.
Not entirely surprised, but emotionally a bit down, to put it that way. It felt a little bit like a kick to the stomach. Not necessarily because the outcome as such was not what I would have hoped for, but more about the way in which, leading up to the referendum, the whole campaign had evolved. So how the official organizations campaigning for Leave or Remain were to be decided was an absolute shambles, and made up on the spot on the basis of what? Well, we still don't know actually. There was not a plan. There's not even a plan of how to conduct referenda if we have one. It's all being made on the spot. And so people in Gibraltar did have the right to vote. Yeah? People who lived in France as expats and who have a British passport did not have the right to vote. People from Ireland had the right to vote. People from other EU countries did not have the right to vote. Unimaginable for a developed country that calls itself a democracy, how shambolic this was. And that has nothing to do with the outcome of the referendum as such. It's just astounding. Now, I know that as a non-British citizen, I have not the right to vote. I can live very well with that. But that doesn't make it less how absolutely muddled the whole question of eligibility to vote was.
I'm not entirely sure that that is true, because my parents live in Cyprus, which is an EU country, and they were allowed to vote, I believe.
Were they?
Actually, having just said that, my father is remarried, and my stepmother has lived out in Cyprus for about 10 years, whereas my father's been there for about 30. And I have a feeling there was a strange situation where for some reason he could vote, having lived outside the UK for 30 years, but she couldn't, having only lived outside the EU for 10 years. Now, that might be, I might have got that wrong. I can email and clarify it if you want me to.
A bit random, isn't it?
Well, yes, the idea that, you know, people, Brits living abroad would presumably are allowed to vote in a general election, but they're quite clearly going to be EU supporters living in the EU, but they're not allowed to vote. But who came up with that rule, I don't know.
Somewhere
Cameron obviously missed a trick if he could have reversed that, because it didn't do him any good, did it?
Well, good evening, good morning, whatever it is. Look, tonight we've had a very good discussion. We spent the whole session talking about Britain, about our renegotiation, about our plans for an in-out referendum. And it was a very substantial discussion, going into real detail in all the areas that I've put forward. I would say the good news is that there is a pathway to an agreement. And I'm confident of that after the discussion we had.
One of the things that was most, I thought, depressing in the campaign was a kind of overtone, particularly on the Leave side, of there is no place for and no room for and no relevance of what's called experts. That started out with Gove, who said, who needs experts anyway? That doesn't mean that the opinion of experts matters, but the description of how things are, for that you have to be with experts. But it's amazing, once people are in their own interest, their own personal interest, required to find out how things are working, they will find out. The problem with the EU referendum is that it's not that clear how it relates to your own personal interests. Yeah? And whether we personally are advantaged or disadvantaged by being a member of the European Union. But if, look at HSL2 as an example of the country. As soon as there is this whole planning process of the high-speed line to the north, people in all kinds of local areas, even a single street, know exactly what their rights are for appeal and how to get compensation for if the value of their house goes, they will find it out. But if you say, how does the EU or not being in the EU affect the property value of my house, or these at this moment are very difficult to pin down, and therefore it's also not very rewarding for people to say, well, I spend a hell of a lot of time on it, and therefore they don't know that much about it. Huh? But as soon as people have a direct stake in something which is clear to them how that stake is organized, they find out how to get the relevant information, and they will listen to experts, and they will heed factual knowledge.
The Remain campaign was appalling. I mean, unfortunately, to a degree, it pandered to the idea that the EU is bad for Britain. So whereas the Leave campaign had basically campaigned to say that the EU was bad for Britain, I think the Remain campaign, instead of saying no, the EU is good for Britain, it kind of said, well, it's not as bad as all that, and you know, really failed to stand up for the EU and the benefits of the EU. And quite clearly, it was one of the most appallingly misjudged campaigns in, you know, political campaigns in the history of Britain.
Gather round, friends, there's something I want to talk to you about. I can see by all your faces that you're all good people, fine, upstanding members of your community, what we used to call white men before the PC Brigade took over our parade and made us afraid to say what we think. And we got problems of every size. Economy. Yeah. Energy. Yeah. Ecology. Yeah. Ethnography. Yeah. Only kidding. So what do? Take responsibility? Well, how do we do that? I'm glad you asked me, friend. What if I told you there was a common cause? You see, we got problems. Right here in Blighty. Problems with a P, and between you and me, that stands for Paul's. Yes, immigration. Yes, the scourge of our nation. It's time for Britain to take back control.
For me, it was certainly a crisis of identity because it very much feels like a betrayal of everything that I believe in, that I work for, of my very identity. It's an assault on my identity in the sense that as a historian of religion, I focus on interactions between cultures. As a citizen, you know, of Germany, of Europe, I feel like exchange between cultures is what helps humanity. In that sense, you know, the vote to leave a functioning union is really a step back into the old age of nationalism, and there's no way around that.
You see, what really winds me up is that they keep saying that the people have spoken.
Yeah, the will of the people, which is, again, I mean, if you hear that as somebody socialized in Germany, it gives you a certain bellyache, because the will of the people, of course, was to have the total war, right? And the Nazis were wonderful in evoking this. I'm not saying that, you know, anybody who says that, you know, the will of the people needs to be done would be a fascist, but I am saying that the will of the people is a construct that needs to be carefully considered, and if the people are given false information, then I don't think we can truly speak about the will of the people. With all due respect to, you know, the necessity to implement the results of a fair referendum, you know, that's different. Had it been a fair referendum run on truth, then I would say, well, it's a silly idea, let's do it. But if it's based on falsehoods, then it's a silly idea that was not the will even of that part of the population that voted, because they were simply given false information, and that's the long and the short of it.
Now I know you all know there's as many immigrants living in this country as there are expats living abroad, just as surely as you know that we don't lose £350 million a week to the EU. But that's not the point. It's mighty tough facing up to the challenges of the modern world when there's a scapegoat right here in Blighty. I tell you what, folks, how about you let me be the daddy you never had, and daddy says don't worry yourself about taxation for the rich, or the state of the NHS, or climate change. Let's just keep the poor fighting amongst themselves, shall we? Yeah. Like in the good old days.
I think the use of propaganda in the run-up to the Brexit referendum, especially by the Leave campaign, is really, really interesting. There are two examples in particular that I would point to that to me really summarize how that worked. So one is the idea of the NHS, which featured really prominently in the Leave campaign. So the idea is that at the moment our tax pounds go to some anonymous institution in Brussels and are then redistributed, and a lot of money comes back to the UK, but through a set of procedures and mechanisms which are not very transparent. So while, you know, I think a lot of people understood that the UK is getting a lot of money back, it didn't feel like something that made a difference to our own lives, that really spoke to our lived experience. The NHS is completely different, right? We're born in NHS hospitals, we've all been treated by NHS doctors and nurses. They're lovely, they're caring. So giving money to the NHS feels like you're directly contributing to creating a better, more caring society, and an institution that you've had immediate contact with, that is part of your own lived experience. And I think substituting the anonymous structure of the EU for something as concrete and tangible as the NHS was a very effective propaganda tool for the Leave campaign.
My friends, you got problems right here in Blighty. And the problem's not you and the problem's not me, it's that guy there. And while I'm joking, the mob has spoken, the white working class is awoken. We got problems with a POLES, and that stands for polls. Thank you.
The other image that really stuck in my mind from the Leave campaign was that poster called Breaking Point. So this was an anti-immigration poster which showed a kind of a curving mass of travelling people that look distinctly other. They look foreign, dark hair, dark skin colours, they look vaguely Middle Eastern. It's not specified on the poster where they might come from, who they are, but that's in a sense not the message. The point is that they look alien, and the fact that they're arriving somewhere en masse makes them a threat. It's a threat to our communities, our values, our way of life, and again in a very tangible, concrete sense, that which we know, with which we're familiar with, and which is now potentially threatened and disrupted by the arrival of countless others who bring, a different cultural background, different languages, different religiosities that might disrupt all that which we know and hold dear. So much the same way as the NHS speaks to lived experience and our personal memories, I think this image speaks to longer term collective memories. And there's some really interesting historical parallels one could think of here in terms of politicians, propaganda conjuring up that fear of amorphous masses from the East to a threat to our Western civilization. A particularly notorious example of this would be Nazi propaganda, for example, the 1940 film The Eternal Jew, Der ewige Jude, which famously showed lots of pictures of impoverished, destitute Jewish people huddled together in ghettos, moving in masses, interspliced with pictures of rats in sewers, so suggesting these people are dirty, they're not even properly human, they're a bit vermin-like, and this idea of the kind of the mass movement is really integral to that imagination. Also that they're in the East and they're therefore the other and a threat to Western civilization.
Winter is over, the leaves have turned green, but red is the colour you'll see. For Britain's foraging against the machine, thanks to the UKIP.
The interesting thing, of course, about this poster is that it has virtually nothing to do with the European Union. The migrants depicted are migrants from Syria or more broadly from the Middle East, fleeing those terrible conflicts and seeking shelter in European countries, especially in Germany, where Angela Merkel's government decided to have a relatively open-door policy towards Syrian migrants. But at no point was there suggestion that freedom of movement within the EU meant that the UK would have no control over its borders when it came to non-EU citizens, such as those refugees. And as we know, hardly any of them were admitted into the UK. Those who tried were stuck in transit camps and still sitting in Calais in rather desperate conditions, and nobody's ever let them into the UK. So what is being played upon here is a fear of the other, and especially the Eastern other, which speaks to, again, to very old and visceral memories and fears that people already have. They tend to think that their different values and beliefs and emotions are a coherent whole. We don't like contradictions. So we think of our fears and our anxieties that we all have as part of a wider worldview or belief system. So yes, propaganda often speaks to fear, but there's always the flip side that you're valorizing a particular idea of community, of security and so on, whilst you're conjuring up a fear of the other.
And the language is very rich here. So I've had close friends and family members say things like, all the immigrants should just go home. And I say, well, as an immigrant, would you like me to leave? Oh no, you're okay. So there's an interesting pairing of unspoken racism, I think, as well as xenophobia combined in statements like that. It's also exceedingly complex. Many of the refugees that come here are from South Sudan, which is a brand new nation state born of conflict in Africa, from Libya, where Western European intervention brought down the Gaddafi regime, albeit for perhaps good reasons, but the absence of planning for what happens after Gaddafi has meant that there's been a splintering and a fragmentation of identities and groups within Libya fighting one another that have pushed people out into the Mediterranean trying to get into Europe. Syria itself, as we know, is a very large intractable conflict born of the Arab Spring Revolution and the Arab Spring uprisings, where the Syrian regime is still backed by superpowers and is able to do what it is doing. And the flow of refugees is extraordinarily large, millions of people, with both in camps in Jordan but also flowing into Europe.
To situate Brexit and to situate the rise of the far right in Hungary, Poland, in Austria, and also, of course, in the US, the most helpful perspective is really, I would think, as a historian, that of trying to understand which force the fear of immigrants has in these countries. And again, I think it's a very common narrative, and that common narrative is by and large nowadays determined by the fear of Islam. I think Britain is special in as far as there's also discontent with Eastern European immigration, but that is, I would think, more of a local issue in areas with a high immigration quota. And here, of course, I think it's more about the distribution of services than of course, there's also a bit of racism mixed in there, but that's, I think, not universal. What's universal is the fear of the stranger, the fear of Islam, the fear of the Muslims coming and taking over the West.
There are over 1 billion Muslims in the world. It is a world religion, it is a deeply historical religion, and it is all over the world, in all of our continents. And Muslims in Europe are part of the European story because Muslims have been throughout Europe for the entire history of Europe. In fact, Muslim civilization predates much of what developed to become modern Europe. And Europeans drove Muslims out. If we look at the 800-year war in Spain, getting the Moors out of Spain, etc. And so just to say this is kind of some sort of recent arrival, there are many communities here that have second, third, fourth generation of people that have grown up in this country.
And I think the key factor here is for people to differentiate between culture and religion and see religion as one aspect of culture, and to avoid falling into the trap of seeing, faith as in any way distinct of culture. That's I think is what gives us much of the problems here. Because if you look at certain cultures, a clear example is that of circumcision of women, right? Female circumcision, which is a big problem, which is a terrible practice for the girls who undergo it. In the countries in which it is practiced by all religions, by all groups. It is practiced by Christians, it is practiced by Muslims. Most Muslims, of course, completely reject it as an un-Islamic practice. And still the press here, especially in the UK, gets away with portraying it as an Islamic practice, which is wrong, as can be, because most Muslims do it. Where it's done, Christians also do it. What's Islamic about the practice? Well, nothing at all. So is there something to talk about? Yes, a lot. Is there something to develop? Yes. I mean, is misogyny a problem that's specifically Islamic? No, it's a problem that, we have in Hollywood, we have in Washington, we have got certainly in London and Berlin. There's been progress, but there's also much to be done, and Islam is no different than everyone else.
It was a really easy thing to cast worry and fear about when a very, very violent, extreme side of politics aligned with some modified version of Islam becomes a terrorist movement. We have equal perversions on the side, on Christianity's side. There are white supremacist Christian identity movements, any number of right-wing white supremacist movements that have very similar genealogies to some of the radical Islamic terrorism that gets labeled as such.
I've made my views very clear to anybody that asked me that I voted to leave the European Union, and I did so because of my beliefs in democracy and freedom. The thing that I don't like is that the European Union has a very different model of law and freedom to the common law tradition. And for me, I didn't like how the European Union was undermining the common law tradition of law. A sort of Anglo-Saxon legal tradition is that I have freedom, or we have freedom. It's not given from above, it comes from me. I have freedom. Whereas a sort of EU model is one that the EU grants rights and things. It's fundamentally different. I mean, they come from different sort of legal premises. And for me, that's been the biggest danger, is that erosion of the principle of freedom. The principle of freedom comes from us as a people. And those presumptions of freedom, which is the cornerstone of British or English law.
Freedoms and the notion of what freedom entails is not something that can be written down. It's a matter of a political culture that grows over time and hopefully is robust enough to withstand whims of the day. And I wouldn't say that common law has anything to do with that necessarily as its core element. Whether or not individual freedoms are there, whether or not they're guaranteed or not, is not even a matter of just codified law or jurisprudence. It's a matter of actual practice. If you look at the old constitution of the Soviet Union from the late 1930s, written by Stalin and his cronies, if you look at the letter of the constitution, gosh, you would like to live there. Everything is guaranteed, individual freedoms of speech, of organization, of anything else. Problem started when you tried to exert those freedoms because then the state knew how to find you and how to deal with you.
I think that the Germans are in a privileged position to be both indebted to democracy, because they see the effects of its, how well it works when it's stable, but they also saw how it can go wrong with the Weimar Republic. And they know that, democracy is such, the rule of the many is absolutely no value in itself, because that's what brought us Hitler, right? And so I think the democracy can only flourish with very strong democratic institutions running it, and with a political discourse that honors truthfulness.
Just seeing the hatred that is coming out in people, and I think that's also because people are scared. Like, no one actually knows what's going on. No one knows what's going on. There's been no statements. We're almost 2 years into it, and there's been a chance to actually pass laws to enshrine some of the stuff that we've had because of the EU. And for me, as a queer person, that is the equality laws that the European Union, that underpins our equality laws in the UK. There is nothing to stop them being eroded post-Brexit. We will not have that sort of constitutional Bill of Rights that protects our equality laws.
So the European Court is actually sort of an extra court, an extra protection?
Yeah, it's like a final recourse for equality and justice. Once you've been through the UK court system, you can take it to the European Court and they can say, actually, no, a judge has to remain impartial.
How much does that worry you?
Well, I think part of this plays into why certain people... Well, one of the key arguments for Brexit itself was the fact that there are decisions in the UK courts that are made, that are obviously decisions that affect Britain, that can then be superseded by a court that is not under British control. And obviously this can be a force for good, but for a lot of people who voted Brexit will see this as part of the problem. And I think this feeds into why certain people who sort of have a fear of sort of large bureaucracies are more in favour of Britain moving away from the EU. And the problem is, as someone who can see both sides, I'm very happy that there is a final check. If something goes wrong in British law or in a British court, and then it can be proven false in a European court, I think it's a great mechanism to reverse unfair decision making. But at the same time, I can see why British citizens may be upset that our final say in the law is made outside of our own courts. So I think we need to be pragmatic about it. We need to say what we want to keep. I think it's a very good idea to have control of your own laws, but you need to safeguard the people who are going to fall through the cracks, who are going to be affected by this transition. I'm very safe in this transition. I'm from a fairly comfortable background. My rights aren't going to be marginalised based on my sexuality, my gender identification or non-identification, or based on my ethnicity. I'm very fortunate in this respect. But the law needs to protect the people who might otherwise not be protected.
You know, my worry is that those protections could get eroded through the changing, through this great withdrawal bill, through, you know, a right-wing populist opinion. You know, because the government is being propped up by a right-wing, you know, Christian populist movement at the moment. And what's to stop that infiltrating, you know, further into our politics and into our own equality?
Whenever I talk with friends, no matter what the political spectrum, it always comes up sooner or later. I mean, there's not an evening where it isn't mentioned. It's not an evening where people express their unhappiness with the situation, and even people, you know, who supported Brexit are unhappy with the situation. I mean, maybe that's the greatest irony of it. There's really no winners in this one.
So I think one of the things that needs to be done is to properly understand Euroscepticism. And I think that was one of the key problems of the direction of the European Union, that decisions would be made in nice conference rooms and in nice corridors, but really not understanding Europe. I suppose one of the biggest concerns for me is that we can continue arguing about Brexit, about the state of Britain, about the European Union, that we can continue arguing and arguing mightily about the European Union, but that we could continue to do so but eat and drink as friends.
It's a very nuanced problem. It's a very complex problem, and I think there was not a lot of information about all of the things the EU has actually done for Britain as well as for the world. Ironically, I was part of a EU Parliament session on democracy promotion after the vote, and I was sitting with the former Prime Minister of Bosnia-Herzegovina and the electoral officials from Burma and Myanmar. And I thought neither of those two people would be sitting in this chamber today talking about democracy, democratic procedure, elections, and peace in their countries without a lot of the work of the European Union. And I think that work goes unnoticed. It's an area of work that's not known to people. And if you are struggling for employment or education within the United Kingdom, you're not interested in, and understandably not interested in, what the EU is doing for democracy in Burma. That just doesn't connect. And I think that disconnect, in many ways, it helps explain the vote, because why would this country want to spend that much money on stuff that we have no connection to? That would be a very, very straightforward argument that could be launched at the purpose of the EU. At the same token, or the same breath almost, the EU gets a Nobel Peace Prize for bringing about 60 years of peace across Europe. And if we think about where Europe was in the middle of the 20th century and where it was at the end of the 20th century, it's quite an impressive display. You know, the war is finished, there's a post-war settlement, there's a development of a pretty strong human rights regime through the European system, and the end of the Cold War, the reunification of Germany, and the inclusion of many more Eastern European states in this ever closer union. And I'm very much in favor of that vision for a united Europe that is founded on those values that are quite cherished, but also have been really, really hard fought over. And not just, you know, civil rights struggles for greater protection of human rights, but real warfare twice in the 20th century over fundamental values of what it means to be a human being. And I think to turn your back on that requires quite a lot of deep soul searching. And I think that's something that, you know, in the ensuing years from whatever happens in March 2019, we're going to have to think about very carefully.